This video is brought to you by True Tales of Buried Treasure, the largest collection of old treasure magazines in the West. On our website, you can search for individual treasure stories by region or by our original magazines themselves. To pay us a visit, please click on the link in the description. Enjoy.
During the month of April 1846, the Donner family was making preparations to go west. Stories of California's unbelievably mild climate, rich, fertile soil, and expanses of land on which emigrants could settle at little or no cost was an irresistible lure. The Donners, headed by George Donner and his wife Tamsin, were people of considerable means. Indeed, all the emigrants who let their Sangamon County, Illinois homes with the Donners that season were financially well off. In the book Expedition of the Donner Party, Eliza Donner notes that had it not been for the financial depression of 1846, a much greater number of people would have joined the westward migration. Further, she wrote in detail of her family's extensive preparations. Strong, commodious wagons were constructed especially for their trip. 3 wagons each pulled by 9 well-trained oxen and with an extra team in reserve for each wagon, plus cows to furnish milk. Several beef cattle, 5 saddle horses, and a watchdog formed only the basics they're planning. They loaded, in addition to their own personal supplies, which were calculated to last them throughout their journey, bolts of cloth and jewelry for Indian peace offerings, oil paintings, school books, botanical apparatus, and other materials with which Tamsin Donner, a schoolteacher, planned to establish a ladies' seminary in California. There were rich stores of silks, satins, velvets, and other valuable cloths, which were intended to be used in exchange for Mexican land grants. Eliza Donner also described the money which her father was taking along. She states that a liberal sum for meeting unexpected expenses as might arise along the way was stored in 2 buckskin girdles to be worn in concealment about the person. Her mother was a writer and was preparing a book detailing their journey. Installments were to be printed by the Springfield, Illinois Journal, published by the Honorable Allen Francis, U.S. Consul at Victoria, British Columbia. Because of this arrangement, Francis was shown the Donners' complete inventory. He was witness to the most secret portion of that inventory, a sum of $10,000 sewn carefully inside sections of a quilt and carefully hidden in the wagon which would serve as the family's overland home on wheels. As to the inventory of George Donner's elder brother, Jacob, we have no written record except that he also had 3 well-provisioned wagons. We can nevertheless assume that Jacob and George Donner's wagons, teams, and general equipment were practically identical, since the 2 families made their preparations together. It can also be reasonably assumed that a generous amount of cash was carried by Jacob Donner, for he too had amassed considerable wealth during his 60-odd years. The Donner Party might easily have been known instead as the Reed Party. Sometime in the fall of 1845, James Fraser Reed wrote to a fellow Mason, James M. Maxey of Independence, Missouri, asking him for information on what provisions would be necessary for an overland trip to California. On November 10, 1845, Maxey wrote Reed a long letter in reply. In it, he advised, "Don't be puny, cheap. Get a good outfit, and the journey is nothing but don't forget to take plenty to eat and all the money you can." So, it appears James Reed had determined to make the trip sometime prior to the Donners' decision. AI had been advised quite early to take all the money, sick, you can. Like the Donners, Reed was a man of substance. He had been a furniture manufacturer, invested in profitable railroad holdings, and held government office up to tea time he left Illinois. Reed may even have been more wealthy than the Donners. His family wagon was unlike any prairie schooner to cross the plains. Specially built, it had an entrance on one side with easy steps, which led to an enclosed room between the front and rear wheels. Cushioned seats mounted on springs provided the last word in riding comfort. And should inclement weather be encountered, a small iron heating stove complete, with pipe conveyed through the canvas roof, provided a means of combating any interior chill. The Reeds had beds atop platforms at both ends of the wagon. Beneath these raised platforms was storage space for personal effects. Drawing Reed's luxury rig was 4 yoke of oxen commanded by hired drivers. 2 additional wagons were loaded with provisions, tools, furniture, books, and even champagne and brandy. These last items were hauled amid his vast stores 1,000 miles to the Rocky Mountains, where on July 4th, he magnanimously provided drinks for everyone in the caravan to toast the national holiday. Reed's wife, Margaret, had a servant women to help with the washing, cooking, and minding their 4 children. In all, Reed employed 5 people to drive his wagons and do general camp work. Even Reed's personal horse was a blooded thoroughbred upon which he would later gallop hither and yon, much to the bitter envy of others who had only mules' mounts. No, this train of 9 wagons which rolled away from Sangamon County, Illinois on Thursday, April 15th, 1846, was no sad group of impoverished sod-busters. Quite the contrary. George Donner's wife, Tamsin, wrote a letter to her publisher while encamped at the forks of the North-South Platte Rivers on June 16, 1846. Their rather uneventful 2-month journey was described as follows. "Indeed, if I do not experience something worse than I have yet done, I shall say the trouble is all getting started." She could not know what horrors ahead. The original 9 wagons of the Donners and Reeds were now joined by 13 others. Kindly George Donner, known to all as Uncle George, was elected captain, and their combined caravan turned southwest from the road to Fort Hall at Little Sandy Creek on July 19th. Reportedly waiting for them near Bridger's Fort was none other than Lansford Hastings, author of popular Emigrant's Guide to California. With such a notable personage of the frontier to guide them, there seemed little question that they could beat all of the other wagon trains that had chosen to take the regular route via Fort Hall. Hadn't Hastings written that his detour would save them better than miles? But upon arriving at Jim Bridger's trading post, or fort, as it was generously called, they found Hastings had already left, piloting another group. Deciding to follow in his tracks, they left Bridger's last meager outpost of civilization and embarked upon a route so poor that it would be August 26th before they reached the southeastern shore of Salt Lake. Here, at a place known as Black Rock, they laid to rest one Luke Halloran who had a lung ailment which he had hoped California's climate would improve. Prior to his dying, Tamsin Donner nursed and tended him. He had no family, and in the moments before he reached death's door, he told the Donners to take his possessions in return for their kindness. His property consisted of a horse and gear and a trunk. In the trunk, the Donner family found $1,500 in gold and silver coins. Ahead now, and westward, lay an expanse of salt desert which Hastings had described as a 40-mile trek. The men filled all the containers with water and cut grass to carry for their livestock. The women cooked food for 2 days, the calculated time necessary to travel that distance if they moved day and night, and on August 30th, according to Reed's diary, they set out. 2 days and nights had been expected for the crossing, but it was to be a weary 5 days before the last wagon reached Pilot Peak on the desert's western edge. It should be here noted that nowhere in the contemporary writings by survivors or historians of the Donner tragedy is there a single shred of evidence that George Donner, or anyone else, cached a hoard of money somewhere on these salt flats. Stories to the contrary must be relegated to wishful thinking at best and pure hokum at worst. The facts are that James Reed's drivers unhitched his thirst-crazed oxen about 40 miles from the water at Pilot Peak and drove them there minus their loads. The oxen, smelling water after some distance, broke away and could not be found later. One of George Donner's wagons literally began coming apart as the wood shrank from the dry desert heat and was abandoned. A trench was dug alongside Reed's wagons, and in it were placed 2 wagon beds and about half of his family's belongings. Reed's 3rd wagon was pulled by a remaining ox and cow, plus 4 oxen loaned him by others in the party in return for some of his provisions. The contents of Donner's broken wagon were simply transferred to his other 2. In early April 1927, Charles E. Davis reportedly found the buried Reed wagon beds at a depth of almost 6 feet. This was only accomplished after much painstaking and meticulous research concerning the wagon train's fateful route. Previous to finding the Reed cache, Davis also found, in October, Luke Halloran's grave. In neither case was discovery of money found. For the Donner party, it was now the beginning of September. Every member knew they must reach the Sierra Range of California by October to avoid entrapment by snow. They pushed on, following Hastings' trail even yet, for they were now far beyond any prospect of turning back. Surely the Humboldt River, along which ran the regular trail, was not far ahead. Imagine, if you can, how appalled they must have been when in the course of their race against time, the tracks of Hastings turned due south. Everyone knew California lay to the west. Was this man Hastings completely mad? It was a route which Hastings had wished to explore the previous spring, when he had been voted down by Jim Kleiman, whom he had guided east from California. South, the Donners now trudged for 3 days, paralleling the Ruby Range. About September 21st, the trail turned maddeningly north, going back in the same direction they had just come, only now on the Ruby Range's western slope. A member of the party, William Eddy, reflected that they were only a day's hike over this range to their own southbound trail. He and others as well knew their race against time was lost. They sent 2 men, Charles T. Stanton and William McCutcheon, ahead on horseback to try to reach Sutter's Fort in California. They were to bring back supplies which would be paid for upon the train's arrival there. On September 26th, Reed's diary notes they reached the regular wagon route of the Humboldt River. Well rutted and worn, it was plain that all the wagons which had taken the route by Fort Hall had long since passed by. As the party grew increasingly more desperate, tempers began to flare. Petty annoyances of the past became fuel for outright ag aggression. The Donner wagons, having stronger teams, had gradually pulled ahead. Then, on a sandy grade near present Red House, Nevada, blood was spilled. John Snyder swore he needed no help from anyone and began beating his oxen with his whip handle. James Reed remonstrated Snyder for this needless cruelty, and Snyder struck Reed on the head with his whipstock, laying open Reed's scalp. Reed's wife tried to intervene only to be struck herself by the enraged Snyder. Reed drew his hunting knife and plunged it into Snyder's chest before dropping to his knees from another blow from Snyder's whip. Snyder was mortally wounded, however, and fell dead shortly afterward. Reed's original partners, the Donners, were far ahead. His own heavy wagon, pulled by a mismatched team, had fallen in with the slower group. Most of those in this group were further down his own social ladder, and by reason of envy were hardly to be called his friends. In addition to this animosity was the fact that Snyder had been engaged to Mary Graves, a friendly, robust girl of 19. Louis Keseberg upended the tongue of his wagon and encouraged the Graves clan to hang Reed on his improvised gallows. But with Reed stood William Eddy and Milt Elliott, 3 men of courage and known fighting ability. Clearly, only more blood was likely to soak the arid land whereon all stood, and time's clock was still ticking against them all. As a compromise, it was decided that Reed must be banished to prevent further bloodshed. Actually, banishment in this land of the hostile Paiute was a death sentence in itself. Reed was allowed saddlebags and blanket, his horse, and no more. Full of grief, James Reed had no choice but to leave his family, beseeching Eddy to care for them, which Eddy promised to do. Sometime later, he overtook the Donner wagons and described to them what had occurred in the rear group. Reed could not survive alone, the Donners said, and Walter Herron, one of Reed's teamsters who was assisting the Donners, volunteered to accompany him. Herron had no horse, but Reed was mostly walking anyway, for his once high-stepping mare was too gaunt to ride. Near the end of October's first week, the rear group reached the bend of the Humboldt. Here the sluggish river turned southwest to its sink. Here also Louis Keseberg told an old Belgian, Hardcoop, to walk or die, forcing him out of his wagon in which he had for so long been riding. That night, Hardcoop did not come into camp, and Eddy kept a fire going on a hillside to guide the straggler. Next day, Eddy, Mrs. Reed, and Milt Elliott asked Keseberg to return for him. Keseberg refused. They next appealed to the Graves and Breen families for the loan of a saddle horse so Eddy could search their back trail. Graves replied he would not risk a horse's life for that of Hardcoop. Breen rationalized this inhumanity, saying in all likelihood the man was dead anyhow. Eddy then said he would go back on foot if the others would only wait. Silence spoke the negative reply. Concern for one another had clearly been abandoned among the majority there on the bend of the Humboldt. Indians began harassing the train as it went along, particularly at night. On October 13th, they shot arrows into 21 head of stock. Not being hunters of large game, the Indians' bows were weak, but they smeared their obsidian-tipped arrows with snake venom, and many of the weakened oxen succumbed or were rendered useless. Reed's heavy wagon had to be abandoned, then Eddie's. What few provisions the families had were placed in the Donner wagons, now rejoined to the rear group as they approached the arid Humboldt Sink. 40 miles of dry desolation lay between them and the Truckee River. Eddie, his wife, and 2 small children were reduced to walking across this hellish stretch. On the second day, he would have to threaten to kill Breen unless the man gave Eddie's children a little water from his wagon's cask. 2 days and nights were required to cross the desolate Humboldt Sink. On the first night, George Donner buried several cases of books and some furniture to lighten the load of his flagging animals. As the party straggled on across this wasteland, the 5 Donner wagons and that of Mr. and Mrs. Wolfinger fell behind. 20 miles east of present Wadsworth, Nevada, Wolfinger's wagon was lost to sight. With him were 2 other Germans, Joseph Reinhardt and Augustus Spitzer. Mrs. Wolfinger was walking ahead with the Graves and Breen families. Wolfinger was known to have in his wagon a large amount of money. Mrs. Wolfinger was remembered by many for the elegant dresses and expensive jewelry which she wore. When camp was made, only Reinhardt and Spitzer came in. They told a suspicious tale of Wolfinger deciding to cache all his goods and requesting that they assist him. Before the job could be done, they said, Indians had attacked them, killed Wolfinger, and carried away his body and property. McGlashan, in his History of the Donner Party, records that George Donner did not believe their story and made some notes for an investigation at a later date. Other than this, nothing could be done except to press on. At or near the Truckee River, Stanton, who had been sent ahead with McCutcheon for supplies, returned with 7 pack mules loaded with provisions from Sutter's Fort. Now, with food in their bellies, good water at hand, and the months of desert travel forever behind them, the band of emigrants became fatefully overconfident. At Broad Truckee Meadows, now the site of present-day Reno, they dallied for a week and thus sealed their doom. George and Jacob Donner's wagons were the last to pull out toward the high peaks of the Sierras, where heavy clouds hung ominously. Descending a bank of the river, one of George Donner's wagons lurched and broke an axle. This iron-willed German from Illinois then chose to fell a tree and shape from it another axle. In doing so, a chisel slipped and cut deeply into his hand. Little was thought of it, but the wound would later kill him. On the evening of October 31st, the Breen family reached the lower end of Donner Lake. Next morning, accompanied by the Eddies and Kesebergs, they pushed on past the lake, determined to cross the Sierra, the last barrier in their path. But the path itself was buried under 5 feet of snow. About 3 miles short of the summit, they could go no farther. They returned to the lake and made camp in their wagons, for that night rain fell in torrents. But they were elated at the coming of rain, for rain would melt the snow up ahead. Back home in Illinois, perhaps it would have melted the snow, but not in the lofty Sierras. Rain in the valleys meant snow on the heights. They found this out to their dismay when they again tried to make the summit. Even Sutter's mules were soon belly-deep and helpless before the party reached the point from which they had turned back previously. The Donner group never made it to the lake. They encamped some 8 miles below on Alder Creek. George Donner's wounded hand was swollen and hot, with angry red streaks showing on his forearm. They sent a man ahead to the lake camp, and he was told of the seeming impossibility of crossing their final barrier. Meanwhile, James Reed and Walter Heron had reached Sutter's Fort, and there met McCutcheon, who had been unable to return with Stanton because of illness. Reed went to Yerba Buena, now San Francisco, and raised $1,500 plus some men to rescue the snowbound emigrants. McCutcheon secured from the communities of Napa and Sonoma about $500 in donations and horses and mules as well. But many weeks had gone by. By mid-December, death by starvation stalked the snowbound pioneers at Donner Lake. Hard bargaining for what remained of the animals took place. Mrs. Reed, without any livestock of her own, offered 2 oxen for one, payable when she reached California. Another traded a gold watch and jewelry for a quarter of beef. Never was anything paid for in money, because no one trusted the others to know of their cash reserves. Bartering was the only safe way, for men had already killed for money. Though suspected previously, this fact became known when Joseph Reinhardt, in delirium preceding death, admitted to the Donners that he and Augustus Spitzer had killed Wolfinger for his money. Spitzer had collapsed from malnutrition earlier. No one ever knew where the two murderers had secreted their tainted coins before both were starved to death in the Donner Lake and Alder Creek camps. On December 16th, William Eddy and 14 others, 5 of them women, despairingly left the lake camp on improvised snowshoes to either cross the summit or die in the attempt. Eddy did eventually make Johnson's Ranch, 40 miles north of Sutter's Fort, more dead than alive. Only one other man and 5 women lived through the 33-day ordeal of attempting to cross the pass on foot in the middle of winter, and they made it only by becoming cannibals, eating their companions as they fell. As January ebbed into February, matters at the Donner Lake camp became just as gruesome. A diary kept by Patrick Breen indicates how the emigrants had come to regard one another in an entry of December 18th. Saw no strangers today from any of the shanties. On February 18th, 1847, the first relief party of 7 men arrived from Johnson's Ranch. They shepherded 21 starving creatures over the mountains, 16 of them children. 3 did not survive the journey. Then Breen notes in his diary of February 26th, the Donners told the California folks that they would commence to eat the dead people 4 days ago if they did not succeed that day or next in finding their cattle, then under 10 or 12 feet of snow and did not know the spot or near it. I suppose they have done so ere this time. Others, too, would sate their hunger by eating their dead companions. On the last day of February, another party of rescuers led by James F. Reed arrived at the Donner Lake camp. They did what they could for the long-suffering emigrants there and at the Alder Creek camp as well. Then, on March 2nd, they started back over the mountains, taking 17 people with them, all but 3 being children. Prior to their departure, Mrs. Graves had directed William McCutcheon to remove a wooden cleat from the inside floor of her family's wagon. The cleat had kept their table from moving around, but it had served another purpose as well. Its underside had been hollowed out, and in the cavity had been hidden, according to Reed's diary of the second relief, about $800 in gold and silver coin. When the group encamped near the head of Donner Lake, 2 of the men in Reed's party suggested they play a game of chance to decide which of them would get Mrs. Graves' money. Perhaps they were only joking, but Mrs. Graves did not like their sense of humor. She took her money from the camp and hid it. Mrs. Graves, it turned out, would not survive the journey before her, though the flesh of her body was destined to sustain others. 44 years later, on May 14, 1891, Edward Reynolds, on a fishing trip to Donner Lake, found 305 coins at a point midway along the lake's north shore, and about 30 feet from a large rock where legend had stated the Graves' cache to be. Indicating the variety of coins which were legal tender in those early days, or which were at least circulating as legal tender, Reynolds's find included 117 U.S. silver dollars, 74 U.S. half dollars, 55 French 5-franc pieces, 49 Mexican dollars, 5 Spanish 8 reales, 1 Bolivian dollar, 1 German 5 marks, 2 Spanish 4 reales, and 1 coin so badly corroded that identification was not made. Some of the coins were lying upon the ground in plain view, where it was thought the activities of a logging operation 2 years before may have uncovered them. All evidence indicated the money belonged to Mrs. Graves of the Donner Party, but its total amount was not the recorded $800. Did Mrs. Graves make 2 caches? If so, her second cache still remains to be found. Reed left 3 of his men behind to cut wood and otherwise help those emigrants still remaining. At the Alder Creek camp stayed C.L. Cady and Nicholas Clark. Charles Stone stayed at the lake camp. Very soon after Reed left for the pass, Stone made for the Alder Creek camp. Clark was gone from there, hunting a bear. So Stone talked to Cady, and then they both talked to Tamsin Donner. For a small fee, they were willing to guide her and her 3 remaining children out of that snowy morass of human misery over the Sierra to Sutter's Fort. Obviously, her husband George was too far gone from infection and starvation to last much longer. Tamsin, courageous and devoted, said she would never leave her husband's side so long as he were alive. But she seized upon this opportunity to get her long-suffering children out. Would they accept $500 and some beautiful silverware in payment for saving her 3 daughters? Yes, they would. But Katie and Stone took the children only as far as the lake camp, where they left them in Louis Keseberg's cabin. They then went on, carrying only their packs and Tamsin Donner's payment. On March 13th or 14, 4 men came over the pass to Donner Lake. They were William H. Eddy, W.M. Foster, Hiram Miller, and William Thompson. Eddy and Foster were the 2 men who, along with 5 women, had survived among the group which had fled the lake camp in December. Now recovered from that ordeal, they were returning for those who still remained. Nicholas Clark had himself left the camps, but before leaving, he had told Tamsin Donner of her children's abandonment at the lake camp by Katie and Stone. She arrived there in search of her daughters about the same time Eddy's party arrived from California. Eddy ape-paired to her as a saint, come to take her children away at last to California's sunny valleys. For here was someone she could trust, a family friend who had shared their table on the trail many times. She could not impose upon this friendship, however, and so she asked Eddy if he would accept $1,500 in coin in return for escorting her children over the snowy mountains. He replied he would not burden himself with the weight of $100, but he would take the children out or lay down his life in the attempt. Eddy suggested that she prepare to leave with them, too. Tamsin replied she could not go as long as her husband yet breathed. But George Donner was at the Alder Creek camp, some 8 miles away. Perhaps he was dead at that very moment. Still, she would have to go see. The trip there and back would consume the rest of that day. Eddy and his men had brought no extra food, and there was no food in camp, save the hideous fare of Louis Keseberg, whom they could not take out due to a leg injury. It is doubtful that they would have taken this creature anyway had he been able to travel. For Keseberg had earlier admitted to them that he had eaten the remaining sons of Eddy and Foster some time ago. So the men bade Tamsin Donner a last farewell, and taking her 3 daughters and the little brother of Foster's wife, they set out and succeeded again in crossing the mountains on foot. Eddy and Foster had now walked the frozen route 3 times. The last organized party left for the Donner Lake camps in early April. This was a frank salvage operation, as there was little hope left of finding anyone there still alive. Led by a practical mountain man and soldier for fortune named William Fallon, this party of 5 was commissioned by Justice of the Peace John Sinclair. Their written agreement stated that they shall proceed to the cabins in the California mountains, and if the property still remains there, that they shall bring away all or as much of said property as they possibly can. Should there be any money either in gold or silver, that the undersigned shall receive 1/2 the same as any other description of property which they may find. Fallon's party reached the camps on April 17th. In his diary, he states that at the camp of Jacob Donner, they found books, calicos, tea, coffee, shoes, percussion caps, and household furniture. He further records, "Knowing the Donners had a considerable sum of money, we searched diligently but were unsuccessful. So they went to the Donner Lake cabins and found Louis Keseberg there, and were obliged to witness sights from which we would have fain turned away and which are too dreadful to put on record. With Keseberg, they found silks and jewelry amounting in value to about $200. On his person were a brace of pistols, recognized to be those of George Donner, and a packet containing $225 in gold. It was evident that Keseberg had been to the Donner camp, and Fallon refused to believe otherwise. He put a noose around the wretched man's neck and proceeded to choke the truth from him. His diary records the confrontation. "I said to him, 'Keseberg, you know well where Donner's money is, and damn you, you shall tell me. I am not going to multiply words with you, nor say but little about it.' Keseberg begged for his life and finally consented to show the spot where he had cached the rest of the money he had found. Fallon's diary states, "The money had been hidden directly underneath the projecting limb of a large tree, and the end of which seemed to point precisely to the treasure buried in the earth." He dug up $273. Their supplies nearly gone, Fallon's party was forced to leave. They each carried 100-pound packs of clothes and other valuables, and in crossing the mountains were obliged to carry half their loads ahead for a short distance, and then return for the remainder, walking 3 times the actual distance required. Keseberg struggled along as best he could behind them, over the well-packed snow of their trail. And thus ended the story of the Donner tragedy. But what of the Donner treasures? By all accounts, very little money has been recovered. Though the exact amount is not known, J.F. Reed was known to have had a sizable fortune with him when the ill-fated trip began, as did Jacob Donner. More is known about the quantity of money George carried and his wife Tamsin. We know they carried a liberal sum for trip expenses. $500 of this was given to Katie and Stone by Tamsin Donner, and nearly $500 more was retrieved by Fallon's party. It will be remembered that the Donners received $1,500 from the dying Luke Halloran, and this same amount was offered to Eddie by Tamsin when Eddie took her children from the lake camp. The offer was declined. Then there is the question of what became of the Donners' most carefully guarded possession, their quilt, in which $10,000 was sewn. Georgia and Eliza Donner in later life recalled how their mother, Tamsin, would each day make entries in her diary and journal, and sometimes make sketches of the mountains or other scenery. None of these items were ever found. Tamsin doubtlessly treasured her writings and drawings very dearly. They were very likely valued only second in importance to her money-lined quilt. Can we not speculate that she therefore hid all these items in some secure place? It would have been out of character for her to do otherwise. And where did Spitzer and Reinhardt hide the fortune which they admittedly stole from Wolfinger? Both died of starvation in the emigrant camps without revealing the spot. Charles McGlashan compiled his History of the Donner Party in 1879 when many of the tragedy's survivors were still alive to provide him with first-hand information. In Chapter 20, he writes there was at Donner's camp a large sum of money, between $6,000 and $14,000, which no one ever recovered. The Donner camp was on Alder Creek, a tributary of Prosser Creek, and is located about 1/2 mile northwest of Prosser House, as marked on the U.S. topographical map, Truckee Quadrangle, 1895. The site of the emigrants' lake camp is on the north shore B.F. Donner Lake, where a large memorial statue has been erected. Everything seems to indicate that somewhere nearby these two sites, a sizable sum of money in more than one cache, still remains for the skillful searcher to seek out.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to read the original article or purchase the magazine from which it was taken, please check out our website, truetalesofburiedtreasure.com.